Iris.
Pardon?
Welcome to Hosio.
Thank you. It's very nice of you to have me.
Oh, is it Martin is here?
Yeah, Martin's here. I think some other people will be.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of check that I can actually share my screen. So do you mind if I do that?
Oh,
Yes,
no, go ahead.
I have to make you a host. Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
There you go.
I often have trouble getting up what I need. So
Is it too loud for you?
here we go. Okay. So here.
Well, while Iris is
There we go.
wonderful. Let me do a little bit of introduction before Iris started. In case you don't already know Iris. Iris Lav, as you know, she recently published a book, A Wife in Bangkok. But it doesn't really have much to say about her background. Iris grew up in Chicago, and her husband, Michael, I think worked for the World Bank, and in the 1970s, they moved to Thailand, Bangkok. And after she came back, she spent the last 25 years before her retirement, a couple of years ago, in the policy analysis and management, with an emphasis on improving policies for low-income and moderate-income families. And she was a senior official with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. She has also taught public finance at Johns Hopkins University and George Mason. And in 1999, she received the prestigious Stephen D. Goh Award for contributions to state and local fiscal policy. She has an MBA from George Washington University and an AB from University of Chicago. Iris and her husband travel extensively in the United States and abroad. And I believe one of their children, I believe a son, lives in Israel. Am I incorrect, Iris?
Yes, that's right. He lives in Jerusalem.
Wonderful. So
20 years.
And I've taken up several minutes of your time. Please go ahead and tell us about your life in Bangkok.
Thank you for having me. So this novel that I wrote, A Wife in Bangkok, was published in September. In the novel, I present a picture of how very different things were in 1975 Thailand. Beautiful and interesting, but very hard for my main character to navigate. I deliberately made the protagonists in the story Christians from Oklahoma, to be sure that nobody thought I was writing about our own experience. It was quite different. So this is fiction. And many of the things that happened to the wife, Crystal, particularly her intense loneliness, would probably not have happened if she were Jewish. That is because when we arrived in Bangkok, we immediately sought out the Jewish community and were warmly welcomed. My talk today has 3 parts. A little about the history of the community, what I experienced. The second part is what I experienced in the mid-70s there. And the third part is how the community has changed since then, to the extent I know. So for history, I, in part or in significant part, relied on this this book, Jews in Thailand. Martin knows about this book, and by Ruth Gerson and Stephen Mellinger, which unfortunately is out of print nowadays, but was published in Thailand and by a Thai press in 2011. But I also did know some of the history when I was there as well. And Ruth Gerson was a very good friend of mine when we lived there. So there have been Jews in Thailand since the 17th century, probably traders. Until the 1950s, there was very little communal Jewish activity going on. There were a few observant families, sometimes services in someone's house, and a sort of communal Pesach Seder. The first effort to create an informal community was in 1950, but it didn't become a formal community recognized by the Thai government until 1963. And in 1966, a synagogue opened in a converted house that had been donated by the widow of a wealthy Jewish gem dealer. Her name was Elizabeth Zerner, and it was called Beit Elisheva, after the name of the donor. There were two types of permanent resident Jewish families at that time, Ashkenazi and Sephardi. One long-term Ashkenazi family, the Gersons, came from Russia in 1920. And there were other Ashkenazis as well for a variety of reasons. And the Sephardi families were fewer than the Ashkenazi families, but they came from Syria and Lebanon, and they were very prominent in the community. And they were led by the Jamal family, D-J-E-M-A-L, and Isaac Jamal's nephew, Salim Ubani. Salim arrived in 1959 to work in his uncle's business. And of course, there were many transient Jews who lived there for a few years. When we arrived in 1975, Beit Elisheva was the one and only synagogue. The volunteer lay religious leader was Salim Ubani. He was from Aleppo, Syria, and had also lived in Lebanon and Israel. He was a religious and classically trained Sephardi Jew who, for all purposes, was the community's rabbi. He was able to lead both Ashkenazi and Sephardi services. At the time we were there, the community had two Torahs, one Ashkenazi and one Sephardi. I'm sure that all of you know the old joke about the Jew marooned on the island. When he was rescued, they saw two huts that he had built and as synagogues. And when asked why, he said he prayed in one, and the other was the one he would never set foot in. So I grew up in a community on the south side of Chicago in which there was one Orthodox, one conservative, and two Reformed congregations, and plenty of people who would not set foot in the one to which they did not belong, especially people from the Orthodox shul where my parents belonged. I was astounded to find in Bangkok one synagogue attended by Reform, conservative, and Orthodox Jews from all over the world. North America, Europe, Israel, elsewhere in the Middle East, even India. Ashkenazim and Sephardim, all managing to pray and conduct communal activities together. The services were Orthodox, sometimes in Ashkenazi and sometimes in Sephardi Nusach and Minhag style. Service leaders were only men, and women did not participate in the ritual. But there was mixed seating, at least at that point. It was a wonder of compromise that, if I may say, is rarely found among Jews, who are better known, of course, by the adage, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. At that time, there were probably 100 or 150 Jews in Bangkok. It was hard to know for sure because some Jews were not attached to the community and usually didn't identify as Jews. Some were intermarried, except for the purpose of the Pesach Seders, which I will describe in a minute. On the first Friday evening after our arrival in Bangkok in late April 1975, we set out to find the shul I just described. We were staying in a hotel until we found a house, and so we were able to get the address from the concierge. And we got into a taxi and showed him the address. And he drove around and drove around and drove around and never found the shul. After Shabbat was over, we called Salim Ubani and explained the twists and turns you needed to make in order to get to the shul. Bangkok is a city of tiny little lanes that branch off one another, and the addresses don't mean that much. Having made it to services the next Friday night, we were introduced all around and warmly welcomed by the 30 or 40 people there. We discovered that the community was made up of permanent residents and transients, as I said. The Jews there were merchants, lawyers, doctors, gem dealers, diplomats, United Nations personnel, and members of the US military. There were services on every Friday night and only sometimes on Shabbat morning. I asked about the Hebrew school for our then not quite 5-year-old who had been attending one in DC before we left and was told to bring him the next week on Friday afternoon. When I got there with him, very pregnant with our second child, which is how I arrived there, I was pressed into substitute teaching his class of about 8 or 10 preschoolers because the teacher hadn't shown up. Teaching a class of children that young was not my strong suit, but I did it, because I was asked. The next fall after I'd given birth, I became a regular teacher in the once-a-week religious school, teaching Jewish history to 10 to 12-year-olds. I was, of course, invited to attend a sisterhood meeting shortly after we arrived. Showing up at the meeting, I was asked to take over the activity of visiting the sick of the community. There was no way I, of course, could refuse to take on that mitzvah, so I did. Toward the end of my novel, my protagonist, Crystal, finally finds a church to join, attends the women's group at that church, and is given the comparable job. I transposed my experience to her. I was becoming pretty enmeshed in the community. I'd had to leave my job in DC when we moved, and I did not have permission to work in Thailand. And we had 5 servants taking care of the chores of living. So I had some free time. Most of the women friends I made were members of the Jewish community, although we were lucky enough to have Thai friends, which is unusual for expats, and also socialize with people related to my husband's job. I traveled around the country learning about Thai art, architecture, and culture with a group that were volunteers for the National Museum of Thailand. That organization plays a role in my novel as well. It had been started a few years before by some Jewish women, and Jews were well represented in it. Very few members of the community kept kosher. Anyone who wanted to do so ate only basically fruits, vegetables, rice, eggs, and fish, most of the time. Dairy products were not eaten by Thais and so were not readily available. However, if an Israeli family from the embassy or technical assistance project gave birth to a son, then the Israeli government sent a mole for the Brit Milah. The moil also was usually a shochet, so the Jews who kept kosher were able to stock their freezers with chickens. The big event of the year was Pesach. There was a communal Seder on the first night of Pesach, and everyone was expected to attend. Jews one never saw any other time of the year came to it. It was open to tourists as well. It was held in a hotel that was owned by a Jewish family. When they had built the hotel, they had created a separate Pesach kitchen with everything that was needed. It was kept locked all year and opened up each Pesach, so koshering wasn't an issue. A member of the community who was military attached to the American embassy had the PX, the Post Exchange, order 100 kosher chickens from the US delivered to Bangkok. How he convinced them that he needed 100 kosher chickens, I have no idea. And the Israeli embassy ordered matzah and kosher wine for the community. Okay, so unfortunately, there never was enough matzah. One year I was in charge of doling it out. 1 pound box to each family with possibility of another if it was left, if there was enough left. It was not a pleasant task because people were not too happy with that. So most of the Ashkenazim there decided they would follow Sephardi rules and eat rice on Pesach. Otherwise, they would be pretty hungry. There were also no potatoes in Thailand. As you well know, Judaism is many things. It's a set of mitzvot, communal prayer, mutual support, among other things. But there's also the taste of Judaism, Jewish food, without which one can really feel deprived. The first year I was there, I wanted to make gefilte fish. I was in the habit of making gefilte fish from scratch for holidays, using my mother and Bubby's recipe. I brought along a hand crank grinder, my large wooden chopping bowl, and my handheld chopper. The latter two I had inherited from my mother because she really didn't do it herself anymore. The problem was what fish to use. All the fish there had Thai names. And our habit was to use 4 different kinds of fish. So how did I figure this out? I went to the elder Mrs. Gerson, and she, who had come there from Russia, and my parents are also from Russia there. She was from actually Odessa and mine were from Belarus, but it was close enough. And she told me which fish to use. And in fact, to this day, on my gefilte fish recipe, I have the name of the fish. I don't know if you can see that written in Thai. I no longer know what that says. I spoke Thai well, but I never learned to read it. So, but she had written it there for me, or someone had. So, and you know, wonder of wonders, after I used this fish and made the gefilte fish, it tasted just like my family's. Word got out of what I had done. The next holiday, about 5 women in the community asked if they could make gefilte fish with me. Each came with a maid to help with the grinding, chopping, and mixing, and quantities of fish ready to be cleaned and deboned. There's none of this buying fillets there. Luckily, our house had a large kitchen that was screened in rather than fully walled, so we didn't have a huge smell. And we had some large food prep tables. So we had a wonderful gefilte fish making party. So it feels very strange in many ways to be a Jew in Thailand. The official religion of Thailand is Buddhism. Despite the stated desire of the Buddha, as I understand it, to not be worshipped as a god, there are Buddha statues and spirit shrines everywhere. And it's not only the Buddha, but they also actually worship some of the Hindu pantheon and some other various and sundry other spirits. There was a shrine in front of every house, including ours, because nobody would work for us if we didn't have it. It was in front of or inside every business, to say nothing of the many Buddhist temples and shrines everywhere. One sees the Thai people are praying to them and prostrating themselves before them. So let me just show you this for a minute. This is what the shrine or the spirit house would look like. That might be, or it would look a lot different, but anyway, this is something like what you find outside a business or outside a home. And then there are the ways people pray. So here's one picture. There's a large Buddha statue and someone prostrated in front of it. This is a pretty fancy temple. They're not all that fancy. This is sort of a more common sight, which would be like this. You might see this in any number of places around Bangkok. So, I have a lot of respect for Buddhist teaching. They have great ethical and moral teachings. But in our language, the language of Tanakh, these are idols. I don't know about you, but I was taught from a very young age that bowing down to idols is wrong, something Jews must never do. Here's a story about our second son, then 2 years old, who had been born shortly after we got there, and who chattered in the Thai language and had picked up a lot of Thai manners. I was taking him to a nearby barber shop to get a haircut. He stopped as we walked in, turned toward its shrine, put his hands together like that in a prayer motion and said something respectful, in Thai. Needless to say, I took him out of the shop, tried to tell him he shouldn't do that and had words with the maid who often took care of him. But the behavior is so pervasive there that I really couldn't blame him for imitating it. He'd see it all the time. So at the other extreme, around the same time, our nearly 7-year-old told one of our maids that she should stop worshiping false gods. We had to explain to him the importance of respecting other people's religions. Such is the joy of trying to raise Jewish children in a Buddhist land. So one pretty strange thing happened at the show while we lived in Bangkok. It sounds almost like a parable, but it actually happened. You may have even heard about it. Just before the high holidays, a Hasidic Rabbi Zahn who lived in Jerusalem was in New York for his son's wedding. He boarded a KLM flight that would take him back to Jerusalem before the holiday began. He was supposed to change planes in Athens to an El Al from Athens to Jerusalem, he fell asleep and he didn't get off in Athens to catch that El Al flight. Now, obviously that would never happen today, but back then the airlines were a lot calmer and, they were less worried about what people were doing and so forth. The plane's next stop was Beirut, and he got up and hid in a bathroom until they closed the doors again. And then the next stop was Bombay, and he didn't think he could get off there either. And he thought he needed a visa, and he didn't have it. And the next stop was Bangkok. That's what a lot of flights did back then. They sort of puddle jumped around KLM and Pan Am and so forth. Somehow, he was allowed to disembark in Bangkok, even though he didn't have a visa, which definitely would have been required. And he hadn't paid to travel so far. He immediately found his way to the Israeli embassy, which was already closed for the holiday. And a guard gave him the address of the synagogue, still just Beit Elisheva, and a hotel within walking distance of the show. He got lost trying to find the show from his hotel, and he arrived after services were over. The congregants were milling around outside. He insisted on staying in the shul overnight, and the Jamal sent over kosher food and bedding. In the morning, he walked to the prayer hall, but he saw men and women were sitting together. He went off to pray in a classroom. When he was noticed, he said that he could not pray with the community unless the men and women separated. He was in full Hasidic garb and so forth. They did. The men and women did separate, and this rabbi stayed through the holidays. Congregants helped him get back to Israel. After he left, there was a compromise. In the first few rows, men and women would sit on separate sides of the middle aisle. Behind the first rows, men and women could sit together. So this was very much in the overall cooperative spirit of Beit Elisheva. So the third part of my talk is what's going on since then. We left Bangkok in 1977. In 1979, there was the revolution in Iran. Americans remember it for the American embassy hostages. But for most Jews living in Iran, the situation after the revolution became quite untenable. Many Iranian Jews were gem dealers and already had relationships with the Jewish dealers in Thailand. So there was a sizable immigration of Iranian Jews to Bangkok. Many of them were quite observant. At first, they joined the community in Beit Elisheva. We in kind of the mid-'80s, we took a trip back to Thailand, and I met some of them there. But they were not as comfortable with the various compromises, and Beit Elisheva was far from the gem dealing district where many of them wanted to live, close to their shops. So in 1984, they established a second synagogue called Eben Chen, or Beautiful Stone, appropriate for their occupation. Evan Chaim is solely Sephardi congregation. In 1993, a Chabad rabbi arrived to open a Chabad presence in Bangkok and ultimately elsewhere in Thailand. He opened a Chabad house called Or Menachem, the Light of Menachem, after Menachem Shearson. And he did it in the area of Bangkok where young Israelis often visit, because it's a place where there are cheap hotels and hostels. And it's a very standard place for young Israelis to go immediately after their army service. And as you probably know, they flee the country to go traveling after their army service. That area is also quite far from Beit Eli Sheva. Bangkok is a large city with, I think, at the time we were there, 7 million people. So, but the area where the Chabad rabbi, the Chabad house is called Bang Lampu or Khao San Road. Before the pandemic, it was estimated that tens of thousands of young Israelis passed through Thailand each year. It sounds a bit of an exaggeration to me, but there was none of that when we were there, so I don't really know. From its original mission of providing for young Israelis, Chabad expanded its reach. Surprise. Today, all three shuls are under or three congregations, I guess you can't call Evan Chaim a shul. All three congregations are under the umbrella of the Jewish Association of Thailand, but with the Chabad rabbi, Joseph Cantor, as chief rabbi of the country. The Jewish population is estimated to be much larger now than when we were there, perhaps 1,000 people, not counting the young Israelis, or maybe some people think it's closer to 500, hard to know. There are now a couple of kosher restaurants, and kosher meat is available for purchase, seemingly largely courtesy of Chabad. Rabbi Cantor is also a shochet. One might call all that a plus, since observant Jews no longer would have to be vegetarian or pescatarian. Daily and Shabbat services are available in all of the congregations. However, the Chabad chief rabbi of Thailand now supervises Beit Eli Sheva and Evan Chaim, which follow his rulings. As far as I can tell, anyone who wants a non-Orthodox service in Bangkok is out of luck. Sadly, the era of Klal Yisrael together in one shul is long. So let me say just a couple of words. I think that the write-up said something about COVID in Thailand. Thailand's been closed to tourists since April, which is causing major problems for the economy. That's tourism and the hospitality industry represent 12% of the country's GDP. Bangkok is still banning large in-person gatherings, and as far as I can tell from the internet, the Jewish community is following. The restaurants are closed, the congregations don't have kiddush or any meals, and they're pretty much in the same situation as we are here. There's also a lot of unrest in Thailand now, that doesn't have that much to do with the Jewish community, but it's interesting, demonstrations against the prime minister and even the monarchy going on, but probably not much. So I'm happy to answer questions about Jewish Thailand, or about my book, A Wife in Bangkok, or about myself. So that's it. I have a few other anecdotes, but I left them out for purposes of time.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, to your knowledge, even though it isn't your specialty, what has been the relationship of the Thai government and Israel?
Oh yeah, I know a fair bit about that. The Thai government loves Israel, or at least while we were there. The king's daughter, the princess, paid a visit to Israel, and they didn't show anything else on the news for quite a while. I mean, there was the beginnings of television when we were there, but they had news programs and they showed it heavily. There's a nice embassy there where we were very often welcomed, and there are a lot of Israeli companies, particularly agricultural companies, involved in technical assistance in Thailand. They helped Thailand learn to can some of their fruits for export. They introduced modern irrigation systems and all sorts of things like that. So the relationship, that Thai people don't know the word Jew, but they do know the word Israel. And so, so if people want to know like why I wasn't eating something or something like that, and if I said in Thai that I'm Jewish, they looked at me strangely, and I'd say like in Israel, and they'd say, oh, okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mort Levine. It's my wife, Carmi.
Hi.
I served as the rabbi in Bangkok from the years 1971 to 73.
Oh, right. I read about you in this book. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I have. I just want to point out, first of all, that there's a couple here that he's using the screen name Herbs. They lived in Bangkok the same time we did. They're now living in North Carolina. I'm in Philadelphia. Thank you for everything that you said. It was a nice, reliving a lot of similar experiences. If I may, can I just add a couple of things to what you said?
Sure.
I was assigned by the U.S. Air Force to be the rabbi. I was the only rabbi in Thailand. And from the mid-60s until shortly after I left, it was the military rabbi who served as the rabbi for the whole congregation. The rabbi who replaced me, who was fresh out of Hebrew Union College, was tragically killed in a car accident about 6 months after he arrived there.
Wow.
During that era, which by the way, the shul was not called Beit Elisheva at that time because Mrs. Zerner was still alive.
Yeah, it was.
It was just called the JAT, the Jewish Association of Thailand. And the quote unquote, the political affiliation, in other words, the religious leaning of the community generally went with whatever the rabbi was. I'm a conservative rabbi. The rabbi who followed me was Reform, and there was a mixture of those rabbis that came before us. But like you say, everybody got along. I remember counting up one, I think it was the first Seder that we had at the hotel, where we had about 150 people, and I think I counted up, they came from 25 different countries.
Yeah.
It's a long story about that Seder because of a terrorist incident that occurred, but I won't go into that. And secondly, getting the food out of the BX or from the commissary, from the military, was not hard. The only thing that you had to do was order it 6 months in advance. And in my day, in my day, it came from a military facility that is approximately about 1.5 miles from where I live now, here in Philadelphia. But matzah was always an issue. I had one year where my matzah didn't come in. I say my matzah, the matzah didn't come in. And I had to have an emergency shipment from the rabbi in Tokyo, which was sent on a military plane, high priority. Kosher food also was available through the BX, and we were able to get some and distribute it to people like Salim and others who kept kosher in the town. You spoke about the shrines, and I just want to finish by pointing out that the shul had a shrine, as did the Israeli embassy, for the same reasons you mentioned. If it wasn't there, you wouldn't get anybody to, the caretakers lived in the building, and you wouldn't have any of the Thai workers coming up. Thank you.
Well, thanks for your additions. Yeah, the military rabbis stopped, were no longer there for us when we were.
Well, after my successor
I don't think
died, the military presence was extremely curtailed because the war in Vietnam ended, and therefore
Yeah.
the military couldn't justify a rabbi.
Around the time we got there. Yeah. So
Right. Let me make one comment before I one question. I believe I had the pleasure of meeting the Rabbi Levine in 1973 when I happened to be in Bangkok. I was hiking from Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and went over to India, climbed up Deccan Plateau, went over to Burma, down Aragon Yoma, and finally arrived in Bangkok. And I believe I met Rabbi Levine in 1973. That was the year 1973, although I don't really remember our encounter, but I had a wonderful Shabbat dinner. And to confirm what Iris said, that I think Bangkok, like in Nepal, Bhutan, is filled with young Israelis. And so I think most of the people at the Shabbat dinner were ex-military, 21-year-old, and I was 22 years old, and I was serving with the British Army, working with the US forces in Vietnam. And so I was in Asia. And I do believe the rabbi's name was Levine, although looking at your picture, I don't recognize you.
May I ask you a
My question is, how does it feel to have 5 maids? Do they have enough work to do, or were things not so automated that everything had to be done by hand?
yes, I talk a lot about this in the book, but not. But so there was no washing machine or dryer or anything like that. So there was a maid who was just a laundress, and it's so hot there that people change clothes a few times a day. And so basically her whole job was to keep up with the laundry and change the sheets most days and that sort of thing. This was for a family of 4. And they're not accustomed to kitchen appliances, and the cook goes to the market every single morning, at least back then. Every morning goes to the a traditional market and picks up food, and then prepares it and for the family and for the other servants. And you had someone to clean the house, and then since we had an infant, it's the custom there that there's a maid just devoted to the infant, because there's a lot of sort of dangerous things. And among traditional Thais, an older aunt or older sister would be attached to the infant. That's just the way things are there. It's very hard to push against the culture in many ways. And then a gardener, somebody had to take care of that and so forth. So that was they were busy. I mean, not every minute, but you needed each of those specialties.
Thank you.
Iris,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was just wondering, Rabbi Levine mentioned the rabbi in Tokyo. I was just wondering if that was Rabbi Marvin Tokayer, who now is I think the rabbi in Great Neck, New York, if Rabbi Levine is still on.
Yeah, Rabbi Tokayer was at the civilian congregation. I got the matzah from Rabbi Lav A Jew, who was the military chaplain.
That's right. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Eileen had a question.
Iris,
Oh,
okay.
yes.
Herb and Pat Siegel here.
Okay. Hi.
We were in Bangkok from 1971 to 73 and 77 to 80 at the Army's Medical Research Laboratory near the Victory Monument. And I have to confess, I was that Army officer who caused the chickens to appear. And the story was this: the Navy made a mistake on the delivery day, and the only plane that was then available to bring them was a spy plane. And the spy plane had a crew of some 30 sailors, each of whom came off the plane with a chicken or two. And the laboratory vehicles picked them up, delivered the chickens, and then left the vehicles with the Navy crew so that they could enjoy a night on the town, courtesy of the U.S. Army.
Sorry, I never
In
heard
short, we got our chickens from Subic Bay by hook or crook, but we got them, and it was a beautiful Seder. We remember it well.
those
And
Seders
as-
are wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
We had as many as 350 people at some of the Seders.
Yeah.
And I just want to put out there that Morty was a fabulous rabbi and named our middle child after she was born in Bangkok.
Yours too. Yeah. Did you have a question, Eileen?
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to share some of my stories as well. I was in, my husband and I, and then a third son were in Bangkok in the late 60s. And so we preceded the folks who've been talking so far. We have a Bangkok-based rabbi. We had a military chaplain, of course. We spent a lot of time with the Jewish community taking care of the soldiers on R&R from Vietnam. We had dinners and they came to dinners and they came to services. And so we were kind of the aunties for and uncles for the servicemen who were so far from home. I want to say also that there was a great respect for our religion in all of the places, people I met, in all of the homes I was, and an interest, an intelligent interest in why we were doing certain rituals and so forth. And one Friday night, we were out for dinner, and we came home, and the candles were lit on the kitchen table. On the dining room table, and I looked at the servants, and they said, "Madame, you always do this on Friday, and you weren't here, so we did it for you." This was the kind of reciprocal kindness that we found all the time. I was lucky enough to be an English language teacher for the Royal Thai Navy. These were young servicemen who were going to be going to San Antonio for further training. And one of the highlights of almost every day was one or another of these young men bringing me an orchid for my teacher, Madame. I didn't have that in any other teaching experience of my life.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, somebody was wondering about a rabbi saying, was it Marty Levin? Martin Levin.
Yeah, there was a Martin Levin who preceded me.
Yeah. Yeah, he became more involved, was able to become more involved with our community. And 1 year before we had experts in ordering food, my mother did all the matzah and so forth shopping for Pesach. No chickens, but all the dry goods. And so boxes arrived with all sorts of Passover goodies for the rather small community, Jewish community at the time. We had a very good experience.
Yeah, Joan? You're muted, Joan.
I just wanted to add that my husband and I were married by Rabbi Tokayer in Great Neck. The brother of an older brother who worked with my dad in New York. And when he came back to Great Neck, he went as an associate rabbi, the shul where I was bat mitzvahed at. So he was at my bat mitzvah and he married us, and he is a wonderful man. I also want to say that we were in Bangkok for a conference. My husband had to be there, and it turned out that in the hotel next door was the Chabad. So we were able to go to Friday night services, and I was surprised because when we were there in Nepal, they were very welcoming, and the women were quickly diverted to behind the mechitza there in where we were, and nobody talked to us. So it was very odd, but we were able to attend services. But that's
interesting. All. Yeah, I mean, I found we travel a lot, and sometimes Chabad is really nice to us.
Mostly, that's been our experience. It was just odd, but it could have been an off night. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe the multiplicity of, I don't know.
In Nepal, we did see lots of Israelis, and they invited everybody. The Rebbitzin made dinner every Friday night. There must have been 50 people, and invited us, and we didn't stay because we didn't have the time. But it was really quite lovely.
My wife and I were in Nepal 2 years ago, and the Shabbat dinner must have about 500 to 600 people in the little shack, basically in the little shack. Are you aware that the founding rabbi, the Chabad, actually came from Brooklyn? It was his first job, and it has stayed ever since for almost 30 years now. And to top it, Israel seems to be very much an expert in sending over a Pesach dinner wherever people ask. 1 year, Chabad in Nepal asked for Pesach dinners, and Israel shipped 2,000 Pesach box dinners by the Israel Air Force Nepal, just for them to have a Pesach. There were about 2,000, about 1,800 were Israelis.
I was surprised when we were walking around that neighborhood before we got to Chabad. All of a sudden, I turned to my husband. I said, "See that store? Isn't that Hebrew?"
Yeah.
And we were catering to a great number of Israelis, and that was a big surprise.
Anyway, thank you very much. If you don't have any more questions, this is time for our evening service. You're welcome to join our Mincha service at 6:30. Thank you very much, Iris. That's wonderful to hear the story about you in Bangkok. I hope all these people will be buying your book to get deeper into your experience living in Bangkok.
Thank you very much.
It's available wherever books are sold.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.